To the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome, one and all, to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Crosstime Pub, a region of space and time well regarded for being friendly toward humankind's favorite four-legged kindred across the ages, all seven of them, by the way. Jason Pentrail is in the house. By the way, where's Kazrain tonight? I haven't seen her sneaking around the pub any this evening.
She's skulked away down to South Carolina, but as I'm looking out here on the patio, I'm pretty sure I'm watching this guy give his dog the remains of what looks like a Reuben sandwich.
Ah, yeah, I didn't even know we served those here in the pub. James, I hope you are hungry and ready to dive in.
I am, and I probably would fight that dog for the rest of that Reuben. I'm about to starve, I think.
Hungry, huh? Yeah, I like a good Reuben. A good sandwich in general. Although I think I have to be in the right mood. I don't ever eat a lot of bread. That's kind of my rule here around the bunker. My mother, on the other hand, she makes wonderful bread of every kind. When I was a kid, she would make the best French bread. And recently I went over to visit Mom and Dad. We had dinner. And she had made this pumpkin bread that had nuts and raisins in it. Oh my God, it was incredible.
Yeah, that sounds delicious, Mike. Can't lie, I love bread myself, but I do try to avoid it quite a bit just to keep the carbs down. The older I get, it's easier for me to get rounder in the middle, let me put it like that. So I save all my bread for the liquid kind.
You're in shape, James. Round is a shape.
It is a shape, yeah. I've kind of had this nagging injury for the last few months, and because I had intended to run a marathon in the spring and then train for an ultra marathon later on. Yeah, that's not been happening, so it's kind of difficult to keep the weight off,
I can definitely sympathize. I try to exercise every day a little bit and then do weight training at least every other day. But, from time to time I have some back pain, and you have to be really careful. You don't want to exacerbate ongoing pain, and I usually don't ever have any kind of trouble because I'm very careful about it. But that's the whole key, is that sometimes you can't do all the things you want to do if you want to prevent injury. And, that can be problematic. Jason, I know you've been exercising a lot there, sir, don't you? You hit the gym like every morning, don't you?
Yeah, I just go Monday through Friday and, mix it up a little bit. Usually about an hour and a half before work. And that kind of gets the day started right. But it does make you want to crash out by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So, I try to stay in shape. I'm over 40 now, so it's one of those important things. However, rye bread with pastrami and secret sauce is probably always going to win. I'm not going to lie.
It's incredible, isn't it? While we're talking about food here in this opening segment, I should let you guys know we were watching these wonderful PBS documentaries in this series called Native America. And they are incredible. But I think it was the same night Mom had made the pumpkin bread. We're standing around after dinner, and they've got PBS on. And normally it annoys me to no end when they've got the TV blasting in the background. After a midterm election like we've just weathered through, I don't want to see any more TV for maybe a couple of months. But these shows, I got to tell you, Native America on PBS, I didn't know that you could stream them from the PBS website. And then Jason was there in the messenger chat, the 7 Ages chat, saying, have you guys seen this series? And I thought, how funny, he's onto this too. Of course, he always is, though. And not only has he been watching them, but Jason sent us the links to where you could watch them online. So I was able to sit down and really watch this series and some of the other great archaeological and historical content that PBS offers. That is an untapped resource that is, I got to tell you, I haven't watched Netflix for the last week. I've been catching up on all the cool PBS stuff. Not something that you hear every day, but I guess it's just evidence that I'm aging. I'm trying to age gracefully, but I sit around in my spare time now, guys, watching PBS documentaries. But tell me they aren't great.
No, they're fantastic. And, as we're watching the animation and everything that they're using in the Native America, it kind of reminded me of the Cosmos series, because they do the, the bright color animation and all the little extras that kind of bring it to life. And once you get into the PBS app, because I use it on a Roku box, so you can go in there, or you can go straight to the website, pbs.org. But, there's all those extra episodes of Secrets of the Dead, which is a great show. Also, the Nova specials. Everybody loves the Nova specials. Even if you're not familiar with everything else on PBS, most people are familiar with the Novas. So, it's a great resource. I've been doing the same thing. I've been watching them almost every night, and I'm really enjoying it. They cut through a lot of the fringe stuff, and they focus more on the actual science. They're there with the archaeologists. They're there on the one we watched about Teotihuacan. That was fascinating. I learned so much from that one. So, yeah, great series, great organization. And, hey, just do a plug for PBS. They work off a donation. So if you appreciate what they do, help them out.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll link in the show notes for this episode some of the documentaries that we've been watching. Of course, the first 2 episodes of Native America, which is, of course, narrated by Robbie Robertson, a great guitar player and musician on all accounts. And then, of course, there's, like you said, Secrets of the Dead, this episode about Teotihuacan. And they show not only the excavations of this tunnel found beneath the primary temple, but gosh, some of the things that they found down there. And after we just came back from a trip through the Southeast visiting Mississippian sites, I came away from watching that documentary with one thing firmly in mind: some of the parallels between the Mesoamerican cultures and the Mississippian cultures and their cosmological mythology, to me, are undeniable. And it's fascinating. The question is, of course, were they exchanging that information through contact? Which I think is distinctly a possibility, considering really in terms of the region, they weren't that far apart. And we already know that from that first episode of Native America, that cocoa was being brought up to Chaco Canyon, and that they were actually drinking chocolate and beverages made with it at that location, which only could have come from one location further south. So again, the idea of exchanges between these cultures around that time is one question, but then again, the idea of where do the similarities in their cosmologies arise from? Is that an archetypal thing that humans just share somewhere from deep within themselves, maybe deep within the collective unconscious, if I want to get a little Jungian about it? Or are they actually motifs and ideas that were shared through exchanges between those cultures? Could it be a little bit of both? I love seeing these documentaries, though. And again, I watched the PBS.org programming, and I think, now that is how television should be done. As you guys know, I get so burnt out with the sensational television programs about the fringe archaeology and all the ideas. Did aliens come down to Earth and do all this? I won't go down that rabbit hole, but again, PBS they've done such a good job, and I truly appreciate these shows so much.
Yeah, I agree. They'll keep producing them, I'm sure, as we move forward. But this particular series is only 4 series long. I think the next 2 come out on November the 13th. They're going to release episodes 3 and 4. So, please check those out. And again, you can find those at pbs.org. So in other news, this past week, my social media feeds and emails were blowing up with this article that's come out on Gizmodo by George Dvorsky. The article is called Discovery of Ancient Spear Points in Texas Has Some Archaeologists Questioning the History of Early Americas. So to quote the article, the opening paragraph says, archaeologists have discovered 2 previously unknown forms of spear point technology at a site in Texas. The triangular blades appear to be older than the projectile points produced by the Paleo-American Clovis culture, an observation that's complementing our understanding of how the Americas were colonized and by whom. So here we're talking about, the Clovis points that we're all familiar with. Those tend to be dated back to 13,000 to 12,700 years ago. Leaf-shaped lancelet points featuring that very famous flute or that groove that goes down either side. Sometimes it's one side, sometimes it's both sides. But new research published in Science Advances is describing the discovery of a new set, so 2 new spear point technologies, and these are coming out of the Buttermilk Creek Complex, which is part of the Deborah L. Friedkin Archaeological Site down in Bell County, Texas. Now, what's interesting is there's 2 different dates associated with these pieces. So one of them is 13,500 years. The other is 15,000 years ago. Now, because these spear points are predating the Clovis culture. According to Michael Waters from Texas A&M University, they may have inspired the development of subsequent projectile point styles, including those made by the Clovis people. Now, that's a pretty hefty claim, but being that the dates are what they are, coming from that general region, we know that area, be it Galt and also at Buttermilk Creek, they've both had a long history of being well known for Clovis occupations. So this could be another clue that kind of sets the stage for a more predominant and influential, in this case, pre-Clovis culture. He goes on to say that the previously unknown spear points were either brought to America during a separate migration into the continent, or they were the model for the Clovis points. So that's, again, two very big claims. There's a lot going on there. At the same time, we can't have this conversation of pre-Clovis points without talking about the Western STEM tradition. Now, Lauren Davis of Oregon State University, he heads up that research, and I definitely want to have Lauren on at some point in the future to talk about that, the Western STEM points, because, again, that is a very unique tradition that we see out in the Western states that, again, lends credence to there being a well-established pre-Clovis culture that could have had influence on what we now know as the typical fluted Clovis point. I mean, this is something I want to be, following very closely over the coming weeks and months as new information comes forward. But, this could potentially be that one clue that kind of changes everything that we think we know. And we've been steadily moving toward a pre-Clovis occupation. We've been hinting at it over the last decade, but these are the type of things that could potentially, and I say this, could potentially move this research forward. Now, these things always, when they come up, they always are controversial, and of course, more testing has to be done. But nonetheless, this is a good indication for a solid and well-established pre-Clovis culture in North America.
Okay, a couple of things about this. So first and foremost, we have another side, this at Buttermilk Creek, and Michael Waters of Texas A&M University involved. Previously on the program, we have talked about similar discoveries found at Galt, which Michael Waters is also involved with. Talk about people we want to get on this podcast. I want to talk with Michael Waters. You have corresponded with him a little bit in the past, Jason, in relation to some private research that we've been doing as a team and some interesting lithics that turned up at that Galt site. But that was even before they went into the pre-Clovis strata and found interesting things there, as reported in a paper that appeared in Science Advances. Now, the same journal carried the more recent publication in relation to this site that we're talking about here. But the narrative that is beginning to form is really quite fascinating, because they are making not only the assertion that there are pre-Clovis artifacts, but that some of them may be predecessors to known types, including Clovis, which are distinguished by their fluted blade, and then something that you mentioned, Jason, the Western STEM tradition. The idea is perhaps that one came before the other, although I think it's pretty evident that the similarity, and this is what Michael Waters says in the paper, the similarity between the pre-Clovis artifacts found at Buttermilk Creek is closer to that of the Western STEM tradition, which essentially these are just lithic types on the west coast and in some other regions that have a stem at the base, which is completely different from Clovis, which typically have a concave base and then a flute, a groove that runs the length of the actual biface, and biface just meaning a lithic point that has curvature on both sides, and that flute is probably for hefting it onto the end of a spear. So if we have one type that these pre-Clovis lithics are more similar to, the question then becomes, do all of those types precede Clovis? Do we have an origin point for one over the other? And the idea of their arrival in North America is something beyond the scope of this conversation, because, again, we have, and again, when it comes to the idea of migration routes, what routes people took to come into North America, I ascribe to essentially what Tom Delahaye wrote about in his book, wonderful book, The Peopling of the Americas. People probably followed multiple different migration routes. In most mainstream coverage, you see people explicitly saying that, well, it was across Beringia, and of course all the genetic evidence also says that people can be traced back to Asia. But to me, it does not necessarily mean that they all followed that route to come into America. And so one of the interesting questions that arises in relation to this, the similarity to the Pre-Clovis artifacts in relation to Western STEM tradition and other things like this, is the fact that it seems to be a preponderance of discoveries like this in the southern United States. Whereas if you go out west, and more particularly the Northwest, you see a little less of this kind of thing. Granted, there are Clovis and Folsom sites, and also pre-Clovis sites in places like Alaska, but you don't see as much in the northwestern United States, where you would presume if that were the migratory route and the primary one, there would be a preponderance of archaeological evidences of this. So these discoveries that are coming out of Texas, that Michael Waters and others are writing about in these groundbreaking papers, I mean, not only is this going to probably lead to the eventual establishment of new type sites and also new lithic types that are identified culturally as pre-Clovis, which is something we don't have yet, really. We have ideas about pre-Clovis lithics, but we don't have more widely identified lithic types associated with cultural boundaries like what we have with Clovis and Folsom. Again, what we may have, if this kind of research continues, is that pre-Clovis designation. But further, we also may have more information about migratory routes. So I'm very interested in the fact that there seems to be a lot of archaeology coming out of the southeastern United States and the Southwest as well, which shows that there's a lot of occupation. Now, Jason, I got to come back to you for a moment. We were talking about Native America on PBS, and they were showing the rock art at Pedra Pintada down in South America, which has also been dated back to around 13,000 years ago, some of the earliest rock art available anywhere in the Americas. Once again, we see that there is a preponderance of that pre-Clovis element in the southern United States and also in northern South America, too. So what does this all say about migrations and about the origins of the Clovis culture? I mean, we haven't figured it all out yet, but I mean, this is very much still a mystery and something we're still obviously learning a lot about.
No, as a matter of fact, I think we've barely scratched the surface, quite honestly. The Clovis themselves, I think we have a great deal more to learn about, but certainly when we're talking pre-Clovis, because this could go back not only 13,000 years, this could go back, who knows how far time-wise we're looking. Are we talking, 20,000 years? Are we talking even possibly further than that? So again, there's so many sites out there that are still undiscovered. As we move forward in time and research, we're going to find more of these things, but we have to look at them holistically. We have to compare them. We have to see them for what they are. So we'll all continue to do good research, and hopefully we'll be able to, in the next decade or 10, 15 years, be able to really put a good solid case forward for pre-Clovis in North, Central, and possibly even South America.
Guys, one thing that I think that we all do when it comes to archaeology, when we talk about ancient peoples, is, we forget that they're connected to us, and we're very much like them in a lot of ways. Yeah. And I love stories or, news items that remind us of that people, long ago were very much like us. So, and I also like it when it's kind of a funny story. So I found a news article here that I'm going to get into in just a second, but I'm going to start by saying anybody that's ever been in the military knows that military service members, for whatever reason, love to put graffiti on the insides of latrines. Almost always, porta johns, that not in the building, but, if you're out in the field or whatever. And I've learned some great wisdom from the walls of the John. Yeah. Good jokes, all kinds of art. So I found this story. The title of the story is Dirty Jokes and Latrine Mosaics Entertain Ancient Romans. As men relieved themselves at the public toilets some 1,800 years ago, they probably would have been amused by dirty scenes crafted into floor mosaics archaeologists have found. The 2nd century mosaics found inside a Roman latrine in Turkey show scenes that clearly play on myth. Narcissus, fascinated with his own phallus, and Ganymede getting his genitals sponged clean by a bird. So they go on to say, we were stunned at what we were looking at. I'm sure they were, yeah. Said Michael Hoff, an archaeologist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. You have to understand the myths to make it really come alive, but bathroom humor is kind of a universal, as it turns out. So I'll leave it right there, but that's one of those things that I feel like it ties the present back to the past. 2,000 years ago, people basically had the same kind of dirty sense of humor.
Well, they were doing the same thing too, because most of us, I don't know, maybe not most of us, but I mean, you guys and I, we have traveled a lot, and you are out there on the road, you stop at a gas station, you go in the restrooms, and that's what people do. They have decorated the bathroom stalls with graffiti, which again, most would actually consider that a fairly disrespectful thing to do. You know, you're defacing public property. If it's not public property, you're defacing the walls of a bathroom stall. But nonetheless, there is the other side of that where, in its own way, it's art. I don't know if we're going to be excavating, you know, bathroom stalls from gas stations hundreds of years, if not thousands from now. But James, what's interesting is that as we're seeing here, the same thing essentially having occurred thousands of years ago, we now look at today and we glean information about ancient cultures that helps us relate to them. And we see that we're actually a lot like people. I guess the old adage comes to mind that there's nothing new under the sun, maybe nothing new under the toilet bowl either. But it's fascinating to me, though, that these sorts of things are turning up right there in a latrine in Turkey. Quite fascinating. Jason, I'm also reminded of an article that you did for the website that talked about some unusual things that were found in latrines. And of course, yes, these, I guess you could say back in Neolithic times that these might be representative of, you know, phallic worship, perhaps, as many cultures engaged in. But quite obviously, if we're looking at something that's just a few hundred years old and it represents a stone phallus with leather appendages, this is probably more likely a sex toy. And there is another irrefutable part of human nature, which is our sex drive, that has to be talked about here. And of course, you did an article for 7ages.org that looked at sex toys over the ages, which is also fascinating because as much as we might laugh about a subject like that in modern times, throughout history, it has been not only as much a necessary part of culture, but at times it's also been totemic and an item of worship among different cultures that have come and gone.
Yeah, and you know, I did that article because there's more of this out there than you would think. And latrines, believe it or not, provide some of the most interesting archaeological finds that you could possibly imagine. If you look at some of the photographs that I put in that article, and this is one that came out a few months ago, so you might have to dig into the archives to find it. But it's quite fascinating, and even some of the Stone Age pieces that I describe in the article, it's funny because when something like that's found, often it's, you know, well, it's ritual or it was used in, you know, ceremonial. Look, you know, people are people, and there is a place for ritual and there is a place for ceremonial artifacts. And there's also a place for just the practical application of something that serves a purpose. And it would appear to me that the ones I describe in that particular article that we're referring to had a much more utilitarian use than ritual. So, hey, people are people, and there's really nothing new under the sun, gentlemen.
That's right. Well, good catch, James, with your story. And I guess my contribution from the journalistic side of things tonight was this BBC article recently talking about, yet again, another fascinating archaeological discovery. This one, a Greek merchant ship. And it's about 2,400 years old. It was found lying on its side off the Bulgarian coast. But this 75-foot-long wreck, found in the Black Sea by an Anglo-Bulgarian team, according to the BBC, is being hailed as officially the world's oldest known intact shipwreck. Now, I'm really interested in this for a few reasons. One, the state of preservation of the ship. Two, the way that it conforms to descriptions from antiquity of sailing vessels. But three, and this is a big one, some of the oldest known watercraft go back much, much further than this one, as far as maybe 7,000 years or so. But again, this has been a contentious issue, coming back to what we were talking about during your segment there, Jason. When it comes to the peopling of the Americas, or just, travel around the ancient world in general, there had long been this idea that, well, people in ancient times didn't use boats. They probably weren't sophisticated enough to be able to build these things. And even if they had, we haven't found any evidence of them. Well, of course, the perishable technologies that are requisite for the construction of ancient sailing vessels makes it less likely that we will find them intact after the passage of several thousands of years. But nonetheless, I think as we are beginning to see, it is hard to be able to frame the narrative for ancient migrations to different parts of the world without the use of watercraft. Now, this is on the nearer side of antiquity as far as watercraft goes, and of course we knew that they had them at this time. It's still a fascinating discovery. Now, according to BBC.com, the researchers were stunned to find the merchant vessel closely resembled in design a ship that decorated ancient Greek wine vases. I've also seen Herodotus mention similar vessels in his writings and other ancient writers too. But they said that the rudder, rowing benches, and even the contents of its hold remained intact. And that's just incredible. And I've seen some photographs. I'm looking at one of them right now. And I mean, this, if you didn't know any better, you'd think this was a modern sailing vessel. They said it's like another world. And this, according to Helen Farr from the expedition. She said, it's when the ROV, that's remotely operated vehicle, basically like an underwater drone, when it drops down through the water column and you see this ship appear in the light at the bottom so perfectly preserved, it feels like you step back in time. And I know that that's how all of us feel when we enter the Crosstime pub, but to have found something like this is truly remarkable. And we love to be able to share discoveries like all of the aforementioned with you guys each week, which is why it's also so important to us when you guys take a little time to write in to us. And we have a few listener emails we should get to as well. I'll lead off here with Robert B. Longley Jr., and he writes to us to talk about pre-Clovis discoveries. So, hey, Robert, you're in luck tonight because Jason had a great story about that. And Robert writes, great to see you covering pre-Clovis occupation in North America. There's also evidence of more advanced structures that have been found over the years, but most have been covered up or destroyed. There's a road network that has been discovered in Colorado, Oklahoma, and Kansas, as well as Texas. I don't know if any of it has been formally excavated. The site in Texas was largely destroyed by locals who gathered the glass-like blocks as pavers for patios. They were exposed in a riverbed during a flood in the 1950s. The owner of the San Angelo Archaeological Museum had some, but I don't know if it's still around since I'm pretty sure he has passed on. That's really interesting, Robert. And I do remember what is described. Someone wrote to me a while back talking about a road-like structure down there in Texas. And much like with the Bimini Road off the eastern coast down there near the Bahamas, people were divided on whether this was an archaeological feature or a geological feature. James, do you know anything about a road-like feature like that that might span between the states of Colorado, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas?
Well, sort of. Kind of like you. It's kind of vague, but because I lived in Oklahoma for years when I was growing up, so and I heard some stories like that about some old roads and maybe some walls of some kind that were found by coal miners. Back in the early 1900s. But I mean, as far as specifics, I don't really remember right now.
We'll have to look into that. But Robert, thank you for writing and bringing that to our attention. Of course, with our ongoing endeavors to document the past and sometimes those aspects which are less often discussed, we'll have to definitely look into that. Also, my friend Chris Tucker writes to us, and he says, listening to the Mississippian Mound Show, it occurs to me that the Seven Ages Associates need to capitalize on the actions of their jinx. He says, in future years, you can plan multiple trips and then approach the tourism offices for the areas that you're planning to visit. Locations that hope for tourism-friendly weather can pay you to stay away, and the low bidders get a visit from the Seven Ages storm gods. Surely some areas can afford a few $100,000 to keep you and the other riders of the storm far, far away. Chris. Thank you, Chris. And of course, folks, what he's talking about is the fact that every time we plan one of our road trips, it seems like a hurricane comes sweeping through the region. And so maybe indeed it's the Seven Ages storm gods that are following us. And if we contact these areas and let them know we're coming, they'll pay us to stay away. And that way we can fund further research. So I like it, Chris. That's a great idea.
Okay, so I finally got an email from somebody. Nobody has ever emailed me before. So I got to read it tonight. And so it's from Tim McMillan. And Tim writes, recently I happened to stumble across the Seven Ages website. And after discovering that we both happen to be living in the Savannah area, I was compelled to reach out to you. I wanted to reach out to you because after stumbling across the Cahokia Mounds during a recent summer visit to my sister-in-law in Missouri, I have been intrigued at learning more about the pre-Columbian history of the southeastern United States. Based on what I've seen on your website, it seems like you might be able to help me out with this new quest for knowledge, not to mention both of us being in the same area. It seems too serendipitous not to try and reach out and connect. Thanks, Tim. And Tim, I appreciate your email, and I actually emailed him back earlier today, and maybe we'll be exploring some mysteries. He also invited me to be on a podcast that he's planning to produce, so that seems pretty entertaining to me.
Well, that would be entertaining to me. I'd love to hear you on his podcast, and so thanks again to Tim for writing, and everybody who has taken time to write to us this week. Be sure and send along your thoughts if you would like to reach out to us. Jason, James, or Micah at sevenages.org is the way to reach us. And of course, check us out on social media. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And of course, as always, at 7ages.org. But while you're there at our website, let me direct your attention, because this is very important to the furtherance of our research. You will find a button there on the right-hand side of the page. I'd like to draw your attention to that, because this is the way you can donate to the podcast. If you like what you hear on this show and would like to support the ongoing efforts of the 7 Ages Research Associates toward understanding the past, our historical inquiries, the research that we do, and heck, even just offsetting the costs of website maintenance, you can link to our PayPal page right there. You don't have to have a PayPal account to make that donation. All you do is push that button and you can pledge any amount, but that helps our ongoing efforts here at 7 Ages, and that definitely will help us if you would like to make a donation. A few people have. We hope you will too. 7ages.org. That is our website, our home on the web. Now, I mentioned earlier, I asked Jason why Kazrain hadn't been seen, his wonderful dog, the wonderful German Shepherd, friend to the program, why she hasn't been wandering around the pub tonight. And in fact, I have a lot of questions about dogs, or maybe I should say ethnocynology. This isn't a term that you've probably heard a lot, but you're going to hear a lot more when we return with our guests David Howe and Meagan Dennison, who join us to discuss ancient animal burials, dogs, and the role that they play both in the archaeology and the cosmology of ancient people throughout the Southeast. It is the 7 Ages Audio Journal. Tonight, we're very excited to be introducing to you, in addition to a pair of wonderful guests, a brand new word in our anthropological lexicon, and that is ethnocynology. This is a neologism coined by anthropologist Brian Cummins in his book, First Nations, First Dogs, Canadian Aboriginal Ethnocynology. It refers to the study of dogs within their cultural contexts, and although the term is not in general use, we intend to explore it tonight with our guests. Now, David Ian Howe attended the University of Tennessee, where he studied anthropology, after which he began field studies at a site near and dear to us here at 7 Ages, the Topper Clovis Site down in South Carolina. And he then attended field school at an early archaic shell midden in Nashville, Tennessee, in addition to working at the University of Tennessee's Forensic Anthropology Center and Chimpanzee Studies at the Knoxville Zoo. He later attended graduate school at the University of Wyoming, and he has participated in National Geographic-funded excavations at a mammoth kill site in Douglas, Wyoming, as well as the Canyon Creek Rock Shelter Project in Bighorn National Forest. In addition to anthropology, he enjoys writing, researching, filming, hiking, or playing with his dog, Strider, and somehow we guessed he might be a dog lover. Now, also joining us is Meagan Dennison, who became interested in dogs after authoring a paper on dog burials for an archaeology of religion class while working on her master's degree. She obtained her BA from East Tennessee University, her MA from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where she is currently working on her PhD. She has undertaken the collection of data on an unprecedented number of burial sites where dog remains have been found. And as Meagan puts it, I'll quote her here, she says, "I realized there was a lot more to the story of dogs in Eastern North America than was available in the literature, and I knew I wanted to make a dissertation out of it." Now, to date, she and David have recorded more than 700 dog burials in the Southeast, although she suspects that there are many, many more, and together they hope to make this data public with research resources on dogs from the Tennessee River Valley, including archaic dogs, as well as woodland, Mississippi, and historic Cherokee dogs, all recovered at burial sites. Meagan hopes to illustrate what dogs were doing in the past societies and the roles of these longtime friends of humankind and how they've differed with the changing of human behavior over time, especially as people transition from foraging to horticulture to agriculture. So without further ado, welcome Meagan and David to the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
It's good to have you here.
To begin the conversation tonight, it's something that I think everyone in the listening audience should be able to relate to. Granted, we have our dog people and we have our cat people. Regardless of which one you prefer, I think everyone can understand and appreciate the human story as it relates back to the earliest forms of canine and how they interacted with different human beings over the years. So, David, I want to begin the conversation there tonight. Let's begin with, why is canine domestication important to the human story?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I just think it's one of the most fascinating things I've come upon, like just reading about, archaeology and human history. It's the first animal that was domesticated by humans for sure. And most other animals that were domesticated didn't happen until after, the rise of agriculture. So dogs, some dates argue that it's about 33,000 years ago we start seeing dogs in the record, but we definitely have them by certainly 15,000 years ago, and they were brought here with the Paleo-Indians into North America, and it goes back so far, and we have this just deep connection with an animal that we still have today that lives in our house and is currently sitting by my feet trying to eat my food. So it's interesting. I think it's just a fascinating thing to explore, and there's so much archaeology out there and so many sites that have dog remains there, and there's evidence of, gnawed bones that were gnawed on by canids. It's fascinating, and there's that one site in Israel where the lady is buried with a puppy. There's just all sorts of fascinating finds out there.
When we look back at the human story and how it intertwines with that of the canine, what are the origins of the first canine domestication? Like, when do we first see this happening in the historical record?
As I said earlier, I think the oldest remains that have been found so far, if I remember correctly, are 33,000 years old, and that was found at a cave in Belgium. I believe it's Goyet Cave is what it's called. And that was discovered it was written up by an anthropologist named Germonpree. That was her last name. I believe she's Dutch. And yeah, those are the oldest that I think remains we see, and those are, you can determine that. Meagan could probably speak more to that, just based on the zoological, the osteology of the skeletons that they find in the remains. But we definitely know that dogs have been around, and the origin of it, essentially, do you want me to delve into, the whole gist of it, or?
Sure.
I guess to start way where it starts, wolves evolved in North America with the canids and what you would think of as the ancestor to wolves and dogs today. In North America, they crossed over the land bridge along with horses and camels that also evolved here, and took habitat in Eurasia. And when humans eventually left Africa and got into Eurasia about 200,000 years ago, they started encountering wolves. And wolves, like humans, we have very similar ecological niches in a way. We all hunt big game. We live in the same types of environments, and therefore we would have been, running into the same prey constantly. And if you're tracking say an elk type animal, and you stab it with a atlatl or type thing, and you chase it, and you have to, it's bleeding out, and you're tracking the trail, you don't just find it right there, you're probably going to run into wolves that might have beat you to the kill if it takes a day or so to find it. And they would have been all over the place. So the main thing is that where it kind of begins, really, is that humans are in the same area, and we're building these camps and cooking all this food that wolves, eat the same kind, and they're smelling it, and they're coming around our camps at night, probably stalking us, being like, well, hey, we want some of that food as well. And as humans start migrating more and more into Eurasia and settling all over, we became an invasive species in a way. And humans are just so adaptable to every situation. That's kind of why we conquered the earth now. But so wolves kind of were faced with a little problem, and it was like, well, we need to adapt to this new invasive species, or we're going to have to die out, according to Darwinism. So what happened was wolves just kind of changed their ecological niche, and some of them who were less aggressive and could come into closer to human camps came in and could steal food and leave. And I think that's the flight distance theory we might talk about later. But over time, these wolves started coming closer and closer to human camps and interacting with us more. And those that didn't run away, or some theories might say that we might have killed the aggressive ones, but that could be not the case as well. Over time, some of the wolves would have adapted to our environment and human camps, and eventually they would have bred, or I would say they had genetic descendants that are more predisposed to being what we would think of as a dog. And over time, the behavior that we associate with a dog would have been evolved from this animal. And therefore, that's what we start to see about 33,000 years ago, is it genuinely changes the biology of these animals, and you can see it reflected in skeletal and archaeological remains. And from there on, we just kind of had dogs until, today.
In other words, we kind of have an adaptation or actually several adaptations that are occurring, which we see evidenced in the biology, but also which was conducive to the animal's survival. And so, there's so many questions we could bring up here. One of the things I want to point out that I like that you said is you referred to humans as invasive species. There was a recent study that suggested that house cats, are one of the most dangerous invasive species because they're killing other species. And I'm talking about in the here and now in the US of A today. But humans don't seem to look at themselves as being the same kind of a thing. And that's something I think we'll see a lot over the course of this conversation, is that humans tend to put ourselves apart from other animal species. Now, looking at things anthropologically, and I want to hear from the two of you, but maybe I'll come over to you, Meagan, because humans tend to put ourselves apart from our kindred in the animal kingdom, but there are some anthropologists who would like to say that humans are essentially an offshoot of chimpanzees, that we are genetically similar enough to them. Now, what's fascinating about dogs is that despite our similarity to other genetically similar species, chimpanzees, etc., you might want to talk a little for us about the reasons that those animals don't relate to us as well as dogs seem to. For instance, an example would be, if I understand this correctly, that if you point, a chimpanzee may not understand the gesture like a dog would, but the dog understands human gestures, which has something to do with that evolutionary history we share with them, which to me is fascinating. In a lot of ways, in terms of adaptability, we are more similar to dogs, are we not?
I think in terms of dogs' similarity to human culture, I think it is something that developed in situ as dogs, as wolves were becoming domestic dogs. The social tendencies were adapted genetically, and we see that today with dogs being as social as they are, and the fact that they can pick up on things like where things we're trying to communicate to them. They can understand language, they can learn commands, and like you said, they can, if you point to something, they can follow your fingertip and go right to it. And I don't think there's any other animal out there who can actually do that.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think that the social tendencies really did get picked up in the genetic development of dogs over time, and I think that's a big part of why they're so important throughout human history and in today's society as well.
Yeah, there's just so much going on right there. And again, despite the fact that genetically they aren't as similar to us in terms of adaptations to behavior, and David, maybe we'll come back to you really quickly just to clarify what you and Jason were kind of talking about there. The adaptations that were conducive to their survival were such that living harmoniously with humans was to their benefit. But we see genetic and we see biological changes over time that are indicative of that too, right?
Correct. And kind of, Megan was hitting at it, and you guys were asking it. There was, it's in Pat Shipman's book, The Invaders, recently came out, I believe in 2014. She discusses how the main point of the book is how dogs and humans might have caused the extinction of the Neanderthals. Which is a fascinating topic in itself. But she mentions in that book that dogs also, there's no other animal really that has white sclera in their eyes. Some of the great apes have it, and it's a mutation, just like it probably was for us, but now that's evolved. But the only other animal on the planet that has that consistently is dogs. And it probably was something to do with what she calls the cooperative eye hypothesis. And it's that when we were hunting back in the day, we would probably want to do so in silence, and you can look at a dog and like you can communicate with just your eyes. Like humans can do that, and that's pretty unique that humans can communicate non-verbally with our facial expressions, and dogs literally evolved to copy that from us. And it's fascinating, and that's part of why they can look at our faces and understand our emotions so well. And I don't know how much scientific data is behind that theory, but it's definitely intriguing to look into.
Whoa, that is incredible. I mean, Dave, I'd never heard that, David, but I mean, if you think about that, here's something that people always talk about, and the dog lovers at home are going to be able to relate to this. There's the ongoing debate, and I couldn't think of two better people to ask this. Do dogs smile? Now, I mean, we might mean that more rhetorically than anything, but, people talk about how their canine kindred appear to possess facial features and gestures and things that are similar, but it actually may be the case that some of those similarities maybe aren't just things that we are projecting onto them. I mean, it seems to me that you're indicating that there are certain evolutionary paths dogs followed that we share exclusively with them that seem to belie that relationship we have with them. And I'd never heard that. That is fantastic.
Yeah, I actually don't know much about the dog smiling thing. I know there's a whole bunch of interesting things people like to say about dogs. I don't know any data behind that. Meagan, do you?
I have no data for that either, but I have seen plenty of images of cute dogs that look like they're smiling, and I like to think that they're smiling.
Yeah, well, it goes back a long ways. There's always that, discussion of to what degree do dogs feel emotion, and we know that they feel sadness. At least mine does. I have a German Shepherd, and she will definitely let you know if she's bored. She'll let you know if she's sad. She makes her emotions very, very obvious. But going back to what we started the conversation off with the self-domestication hypothesis, a lot of what we've discussed here in this last segment makes me think back to that. So if we have a situation where these wolves are beginning to essentially self-domesticate themselves around humans, it makes you wonder to what degree was that initial relationship when the wolves were still in that phase of observation of the humans. What traits were they picking up on? What behaviors were they watching and possibly even imitating to sort of build that degree of self-domestication that we seem to be able to observe in the historical record? So just to make sure that the listeners have a complete and full understanding of that, David, could you just give a brief aside on self-domestication and other theories such as the flight distance theory so that everyone can understand how this relationship began?
Okay, yeah. So one thing that I definitely want to add here that I probably will forget later, wolves are kind of like humans in a way that they're monogamous creatures. They don't necessarily mate for life, I believe, but they do raise their families in a similar way to humans. And obviously monogamy varies from culture to culture, but in a sense, humans raise offspring with, in a small hunter-gatherer group in a similar way that wolves do. And that's something that allowed them to understand our socialness, I think, a little easier. And we humans pass on culture to their dogs, or pass on culture to their infants, but then later on to their dogs in the same way. But to get back to the self-domestication hypothesis, yeah, that is a theory that, for the audience listening, that this says that wolves were kind of observing human behavior when we first entered Eurasia, kind of figuring out how we lived, what we were hunting, and at what distance to stay away from us and how to interact with us. And eventually, the ones that were kind of starving and didn't have food in some extreme cases would have likely been closer or more apt to go closer to human camps. And those ones that could stand to be around humans that long had what's called Lorna and Raymond Coppinger, I believe is the scientist's name. They're zoologists, I think in Pennsylvania. They coined flight distance, and flight distance has to do with the adrenaline level of the dog or the wolf. And it basically just dictates that wolves with a lesser flight distance had less adrenal response to, I guess, seeing a human or being caught at a human camp. And those ones with a lesser flight distance would have less inclination to bolt away from a human camp, essentially. And those with a greater flight distance, as it kind of implies, would flee at like a greater speed and a greater distance away from human camps. So over time, with Darwinian theory, those dogs, the wolves at the time that had a lesser flight distance would stay around camps longer, and those would pass on their genetic code onto the next generation of offspring, and those would eventually evolve into what we would consider a proto-dog or a wolf dog. And eventually those were the ones that humans would be interacting with and, learning to live with and becoming dogs. And it could be that those dogs that I think they call proto-dogs would have then been bred into the classic dog that we have now. And that's essentially what wraps into self-domestication hypothesis. It's that not necessarily that humans were going out and capturing wolf puppies and bringing them back to camp and adopting them. That's called the Pinocchio hypothesis. But the self-domestication just essentially says that it was a natural phenomena that wolves used as a response to human presence in their territory. And the dog is then an ecological niche of wolves, and that's kind of what we have today.
Now that raises an interesting question to me, David, because with regard to the idea of a self-domestication process, a natural process which led to a friendlier relationship between humans and wolves and eventually to dogs, in that framework, it seems possible that maybe some domestication occurred as a result of animal species learning that docile behavior toward humans was beneficial, and then that's passed along to their progeny. And vice versa. We learn that those animals becoming friendlier with us had benefits for us as well. Now, in that regard, if we weren't actively domesticating them, and we were just over time kind of assimilating one another into the pack, no pun intended, could one almost look at the concept of domestication in that regard as being almost more like symbiosis?
I guess in a sense you could say that, yeah. One of the theories is called the symbiotic mutualism hypothesis, which kind of hits on the same topic, just that humans and dogs have such a similar, ecological niche in a way that we both kind of just symbiotically evolved to coexist together in a way. So I would say, yeah.
Yeah, and the reason that comes to mind is because, again, as I said, we were going to look at how humans kind of put ourselves apart from other animals. I wonder about the whole premise of domestication in that regard. I mean, we can, by today's standards, we now know that there are processes, and I think we'll talk about one with regard to an experiment with foxes a little later, but we know humans can domesticate animals today, but in its earliest instances, it may have been more of an accident than something by intention. And in that regard, I wonder about is there really such a clear distinction between a symbiotic relationship where two animals, because again, without humans involved, you look at clownfish and anemones in the oceans, you look at all different kinds of instances in the animal kingdom where animals have symbiotic relationships where they help one another out and they can coexist in what otherwise might be a harmful, natural, or even predatory kind of environment, but they'll coexist because there are advantages to cooperation. And so I can't help but think about early domestication as being, at least according to this hypothesis, less an experiment with rearing animals and bringing them into the fold, and more like a variety of symbiosis that grew out or grew into something different over time as humans applied thought and methodology to it, which to me is really interesting because we could be looking at the roots of the idea of domestication and how it came to exist.
I mean, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. That's more of the case. And I like that you said it wasn't necessarily an experiment, like we'll get into later, but it just kind of happened, and it was like an inevitable biological outcome of the two species interacting.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
And, you have to think about, as a dog owner, this comes to mind, is, to build that self-domestication, to build a shortened distance for that flight distance, we have to take into account things like people feeding the wolves. So that could break down some of those barriers. That could begin to move some of those wolves in closer to the human being settlements so that the other wolves could then observe that and kind of put two and two together. And then, with the wolf being able to hunt, being a apex predator, it wouldn't take long for that symbiotic relationship to build where they could see where they could contribute to one another's well-being. So I think that's really interesting when we look all the way back to the beginning from self-domestication into the flight distance theory. And that leads very well. We've already hit on some of these topics as we've gone through the conversation, but it it lends itself very well to what's known as the Siberian fox experiment. So now that we've talked about the roots and of the canine domestication, the question remains, how long does it take to make a dog? So, David, if you would, please give us the specifics about the Siberian fox experiment. I think it's really fascinating.
Yeah, it started with Dmitry Belyaev, who was a Soviet geneticist. And I want to say it was after the Second World War, sometime during the Cold War. He was, and I've seen some articles say exiled. I don't know what actually happened with him, but essentially he was sent off to Siberia and told to, hey, breed these foxes so we can make furs out of them. And because he was a geneticist and had a curious mind, he noticed that when he bred some of the foxes with others, some of them were more predisposed to being friendlier towards the humans, and others were a little more aggressive. So eventually he got the idea to just systematically breed them in this way to try to understand. I don't know if that was his direct intention at first, because I'm assuming the Soviets really wanted those furs. But he essentially what he did was stick a glove or a hand in the cages that had a glove on it. And if the foxes would bite and aggressively attack the glove, he would call them dragons, I believe is what the word translated to. And if they were docile, he would mark those for, breeding. And over time, as he was breeding these foxes, it's pretty fascinating. And I want to say it was 8 to 10 generations of foxes, which I guess is, I'm not sure what the gestation period for foxes is, but sooner than humans for sure. Over time, these foxes started to have floppy tails, floppy ears, or their tails would, stand up and wag. They started to bark, and they also started to show spots on their coats and had different color coding. And if anyone who's read their Darwin understands through the thousands of pages about pigeons that he talks about, he noticed that if you breed pigeons to have, you want ones with larger beaks, you sometimes get larger beaks, but you also get spotty coats. And if you want to breed out the spotty coats, sometimes their feet will get bigger. And it's just, there's so many genetic things that we didn't really understand about, how genes and genetics like that work. But as he was doing that, he noticed, and taking from what Darwin had noticed in his book, that you're essentially creating what's called domestication syndrome. And the foxes, Meagan can probably speak more to this, but when an animal is domesticated, its facial structure gets a little more shortened. Their whole body stature gets a little smaller. And like I said, with those, outside traits with the fur and the wagging tails, they even responded to their names, I believe, which foxes don't normally do. So he essentially created dogs out of foxes. And it's pretty fascinating. There's, I think, ongoing research with that. And I can't remember the name, but a book recently just came out. I saw it on Audible the other day, actually, but, about the fox experiment.
That is fascinating. Meagan, would you like to chime in on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting concept that just selecting for behavioral characteristics has links to physical characteristics. And you see that in pigs and cows also. You see these similar kind of morphological changes with domestication in all animals that are domesticated. I mean, not all, but in most cases, you're getting animals that are less aggressive than their wild counterparts when you're domesticating them. So things like wild goats are domestic goats are much less aggressive than wild goats. Same thing with domestic cows versus their ancestors, and you see these similar morphological changes in some species, like I said, cows and pigs. And I just find it really interesting that you have this similar kind of link between genetics and physical characteristics. And they're actually they're more juvenile traits. That's what we see in dogs, pigs, and cows, is that their facial features are actually a little bit more juvenile. Like it's kind of a retained juvenile form of their face, where their eyes are a little bit more forward facing. They're like, their eyes are looking at you a little bit more forward on. They have like a steeper sloping forehead that makes that possible. And then you also just get reduction in teeth, especially when you talk about wolves and dogs, you get a reduction in tooth size. So yeah, I think the fox experiment was really, really fascinating on a number of levels, and was incredible research for understanding dog domestication.
Oh, it really is. And now I want a pet fox because, God, they're so cute. Am I the only one that thinks so? Obviously not. I mean, I've always had kind of a neat, I don't know, you might call it a spiritual connection to foxes. They're just a very unique animal to me. But, on the subject of the spiritual, Meagan, I know that you actually got interested in this subject as a result of a paper you were doing for an archaeology of religion class. So let's step over into religion for a minute. On the religious side of this, I've always personally been fascinated by therianthropic representations in various world traditions. Again, animal heads on human bodies and similar, chimeric things like this. And I look at, for instance, the way that dogs are not only prominent, but maybe peculiarly so. We've got dog-headed gods like Anubis in ancient Egypt. We've also got lycanthropy, which, although it can feature all different kinds of animals, I mean, the most famous is the werewolf. You've even got in the Christian traditions throughout the Middle Ages, certain Christian saints who were depicted in Middle Ages artwork with dog heads. What is it about the dog that has caused it to be assimilated not only into our religions, but literally almost combined with humans in many cases?
I'm not sure if I can answer that question directly. I can speak about Southeastern archaeology, though.
Sure.
If that's all right.
Of course, yeah.
So from my standpoint, when it comes to understanding where dogs fit in Southeastern cosmology, we have to start with ethnographic accounts of myths and where dogs fit in those mythic structures. And there has been a really great review by Langford in 2007, Ancient Objects and Sacred, I think it's Ancient Objects and Sacred Realms. Mm-hmm. I wrote it down too. Now I can't find where I wrote it down.
And while you're looking for that, let me just say also that the Seven Ages team, Jason, James, and I, we were recently in the Southeast visiting a lot of these Mississippian mound sites. And I mean, you have to refer to Langford's research to be able to understand the mythology and the symbolism that's going on down there. So for folks at home who would like to learn more about this, again, can you tell us a little bit really quickly about who you're referring to when you mention him?
Yes. Okay. I've got it right here. Okay. It's George Langford. Mm-hmm. He has a chapter in a book. It came out in 2007 called Ancient Objects, Sacred Realms, Interpretation of Mississippian Iconography. It was edited by Riley and Garber. And in his chapter, he provides probably one of the most complete overviews of dogs and myths, ethnographically recorded myths in the eastern woodlands. And what he proposes is that almost universally, you have dogs who are in this myth either as a spiritual guide to the afterlife or as a protector of the path to the afterlife. In the cosmology of Eastern Woodland Native Americans, very broadly and very generally, the myth associated with what happens after one dies is that the soul travels from the body, it travels west to the horizon, and at a certain time of the year, a portal is opened on the horizon, and the soul can go through that portal and continue along the path of souls, which takes them to the afterlife. And we see dogs showing up in myths at that junction, after the soul has entered the portal and is on the path of souls. Sometimes there's a dog who is very ferocious and will try to keep the soul from entering the afterlife. In other cases, the dog is very helpful. It's actually helping the soul get to the afterlife. So it's hard to interpret, in some cases, what these mythological dogs were, if they are helping people or if they're trying to keep people out of the afterlife. In either case, they're there, and they're there quite often in these Southeastern myths.
That's fascinating to me. Now, again, I really appreciate your hesitance to comment on other world mythologies because your specialization is in the Southeast. And so I really appreciate that scientific approach and not stepping out of bounds. And so since you are obviously more disciplined than I am, I intend to show my respect for that by doing the complete opposite because it's just a podcast. You mentioned the fact that the dog seems to kind of mark the entrance to the afterlife, and I am immediately once again reminded of the Egyptian Anubis, which was a god that was associated with the afterlife. and the knight, and also, of course, the jackal, which is a scavenger. But then you also mention a ferocious dog sometimes that can block entry to the afterlife. And I think about Cerberus in the Greek mythology, a three-headed dog, which was quite ferocious. And so, what fascinates me, and again, if we were to look at this in terms of, the continuities that emerge between archetypally or whatever else, between different cultural representations and how animals fit into that, that's what fascinates me about the dog. First, the dog preeminently fits into these mythologies. There does seem to be some continuity. That may or may not mean anything. I get that. And one more reason that I appreciate the way that you responded to that question, Meagan, but I'm fascinated that these motifs do appear, and that with the research we've been doing recently in the Southeast, that you see these things among the Mississippian cultures. And I'll ask you this also about Southeastern archaeology. Is that Mississippian specifically, or is that something that's more diverse?
It's Mississippian specifically, but we know that a lot of Mississippian ceremonialism has roots in the Hopewell culture of the Middle Woodland.
Right.
And we do see what I would call dog ceremonialism occurring in Hopewell societies. We see a lot of dog figurines. There are quite a number of dog burials in Hopewell mound sites up in the Ohio River Valley. And so I think it starts very early on. Some of the oldest rock art we have too in North America comes from the Southeast, and there's a figure. I have no idea which cave it is from, but it's in a dark zone cave, and there's a human figure who is standing with a quadruped, and the human appears to be throwing an atlatl. And it's kind of up for debate if that quadruped standing with the human is the target, perhaps a deer, or if it's a dog. And this is an archaic period charcoal painting that's in a dark zone cave. So it's a little up for debate. Some people would like it to be a dog. I kind of want it to be a dog.
Sure.
Yeah. I can't really speak much to like Western European, I guess, like perceptions of dogs. I mean, we kind of have that ingrained in us, and the Western canon with the big bad wolf and Cerberus and things like that. But I have read, and I'm not any expert in it at all, but like in different books I've read about dogs and ethnocynology, is that a lot of Native American societies like viewed dogs as some kind of like you guys were hitting at, like some kind of in between human and like the animal world. And these people were animists, so like that was probably a pretty important thing for them, at least in my opinion. So specifically, one of the ones that I always registered with that was super cool was the Iroquois believed that dogs, like during creation, they had like the chance to be humans, and I guess the gods or whoever were going to turn them into humans, but because they had such like promiscuous and I guess filthy behavior, I believe is what the book said, they were denied like passage to be human. So therefore, they were forced to be dogs, but it's humans' task to care for them as if they were wards. And that's why we have dogs. It's like they had an opportunity, but we take care of them because they're not genuinely animals themselves yet. And another culture, I think I just posted about this a few weeks ago, the Innu and the Micmac were subarctic tribes in, I guess, the subarctic of North America. And they believed dogs were traitors to the animal kingdom. I saw that recently. And that they, not that they, like in a traitor in a bad way, they just decided to live with humans and therefore weren't part of the animal brethren. And because of that, they weren't allowed to chew on the bones of animals that were hunted because it would offend them in the afterlife. But in a certain way, you could still, it was still like wrong to touch a dog's flesh or bones in the once it died too, because it would offend. It was all about the afterlife type thing. And Meagan had talked about how the southeastern tribes, dogs had something to do with the afterlife. So I think that's a neat thing, and with Cerberus too. In the Greek mythology, I guess in Roman as well, that dogs have some kind of place there and like that ethereal thing. It's neat. It's pretty cross-cultural.
Well, it certainly is, but something else you point out that fascinates me. I had said early on, we would mention it several times, I'm sure, the humans place ourselves outside the animal kingdom, but that was not necessarily the case in certain Native American cosmologies where they saw animals as being, maybe a good term would be liminal beings, that animals in their own way were apart from dogs because dogs by choice sided or lived alongside the humans. So it's interesting that the dog, not only in cosmological representations, but also by virtue of their behavior, seem to have been kind of incorporated more into the human way of life, and thereby the cosmological structure that they fit into also plays that sort of liminal role where they are passing between states, life and death. That brings, I think, to mind a necessary question I've got to ask. You guys have researched dog burials. How often are the dogs buried alongside humans as though the burial occurred at the same time? In other words, the dog is literally accompanying the deceased person into the afterlife.
It is in the southeastern U.S. and the Midwest. It is very rare to have a dog and a person buried together. It does happen, but by and large, dogs are buried on their own. There are plenty of examples of dogs being buried with people. I don't want to say that it's like, it never happens, but for the most part, they're buried by themselves. And I'm taking this from Darcy Moray, who has written a lot about dog domestication, about dog social behavior. It's interpreted that when you have a dog and a person buried together, that the person likely died and the dog was killed to be buried alongside the person. And that may imply that they had a social relationship. That's the way that Darcy has approached it. And I like to agree with that.
I see.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, I would say. And, we've talked about the cosmology of the dog and we've talked about the religious aspects, but something else that I find of great interest, especially since we're just coming off this research trip to some of the Mississippian sites in the Southeast, where after reading over the literature, we see that there were indeed dog burials found at most of these places that we visited. What other ways were they being used? And specifically, Meagan, this question's for you because you've been looking at their burials through the pathologies that you're finding in the dog bones. Has that given us any insight into how the dogs are being used within those contexts?
In terms of pathologies, there are two. Where are my notes at? There are really just two that will give us an indication of what dogs were doing, and this is using archaeological correlates where we have observed behavior in modern dogs, where we can see the same thing happening on their skeleton, and we can take that back archaeologically and look at past dogs. So as far as figuring out what dogs were doing in the past, the most important one, the one that has gotten the most attention, is also a little controversial, is are the pathologies to the vertebra on dogs' backs. So when you're petting a dog, I'll just set it up like this. When you're petting your dog, you start at the head and you rub down their back. And as you're petting down their back, there are these bumps that stick up on their back. Those are called spinous processes. And they begin in the cervical vertebra and the neck, and they go all the way to the lumbar vertebra and the lower back. Consistently on archaeological dogs from the Southeast, we see pathologies on the vertebra, particularly around the transition from the thoracic to the lumbar. Right on the low back, where the ribs are ending, where the spine is heading into the pelvis, we see fractures, sometimes healed, sometimes fresh. Sometimes we don't see fractures at all, but we see that the spinous process that should be sticking just straight up is bent off to the right or bent off to the left. And this has been observed on absolutely hundreds of dogs. And there have been several notable studies who have looked at these pathologies. And there are two ways to think about them. They may be the result of pack carrying, where a heavy pack is put directly on a dog's back, and then it's tied on around their stomach, maybe under their ribs, or tied on around their shoulders. And by wearing that pack over time, eventually their spinous processes will crack under pressure, literally just from carrying that pack for a long period of time. Eventually the bone will give out and it will fracture. That's one thought, and that's been supported just through observing those pathologies in the same location on many, many dogs. Another way to look at it is that these are natural occurrences. It could be from dogs fighting with other dogs or other animals. It could be from them having an active lifestyle where they're falling a lot and getting injured on their back. It could be something that's something that we we don't have a test for yet, but it's genetic. That these correspondence processes, when they're not fractured, it could be something related to genetics, or it could be taphonomy. Whenever dogs are buried, that they're getting broken. I've looked at now about 120 individual dogs. I've seen these pathologies on more than half, at least. They're always in the same location. They all look very similar to one another. I really do. I subscribe to the fact that they're probably related to pack carrying. The only problem with this is that we have never had a dog, at least to my knowledge, there has never been a dog who carried a pack, where the weight of the pack was recorded, and then, we know how often the dog wore the pack, and then their vertebrae were looked at for pathologies. That experiment has never been set up. It's never been carried out, so we've never been able to actually observe this directly. Sled dogs in the Arctic are a good correlate, but their harnesses are different. And what you see in sled dogs in the Arctic is their harnesses are up towards their shoulders and not on their lower back. So you do get pathologies on their shoulders, on their humerus, their upper body like that, but you don't get the pathologies on their lower back. So it's hard to say what these pathologies are, but I really like to think that they are from pack carrying. And we do have a few examples, not in the Southeast, but elsewhere in the United States, in the plains regions, where we see dogs carrying packs in this way, where they're directly strapped on their back. There were some more things you can see in their skeleton. The other things you can see would be like patterns of abuse, which would be fractures on the cranium, fractures on the ribs. From my experience in Southeast, we see that every now and then, but it's not very common. You just don't see a lot of patterns of abuse. So those are the ways that you can get at dog behaviors in the past through pathologies. And then I can talk more about some other things too, like diet.
Yeah, sure.
Practices.
Well, diet would be interesting as well too. But being that you've looked at so many of these, I'm anxious to know, are you seeing a big variety in the size of the dog? Are we talking mostly larger animals? Do you see anything that would be too small to really be considered a pack animal, something that would be more of a pet? How much variety are you seeing in the sizes of the dogs?
Yeah, so the ones that are, there is a wide range of size. Mostly they're small. They're about the size of a beagle, and try to give you some shoulder height estimates in a second. So we see dogs ranging, I'm going to throw these out there, and I'm pretty sure I'm close, from about 35 centimeters at the shoulder to about 50 centimeters at the shoulder. And so that's going between like a beagle-sized dog to like a medium-sized German Shepherd. And that's how big these dogs are. By and large, they're small, and we do see those pack-carrying pathologies on small dogs, which I find really, really interesting too. And I don't have an explanation for it.
They may have been just used for carrying something that was appropriate for their size, whatever that item may have been. Is there any indication through scarring on bones or through cuts in bones of them being used as a potential food source?
Yes, they're often, dog bones are often found in archaeological sites in the Southeast, and sometimes they're found butchered. They're rarely found in large quantities when they are in faunal assemblages, usually just a handful of dog bones, and sometimes they have cut marks, sometimes they don't. Dogs that are buried were probably not eaten, just given the fact that their bones are articulated. Sometimes you do find disarticulated dog bones, and those probably could be looked at a little bit more carefully for signs of butchering. But when you find a primary dog burial that's in a articulated position and doesn't look like it's been disturbed, it probably has not been eaten. And so, as far as dog eating, there are some ethnographic sources that dogs may have been eaten in the Southeast. So in the DeSoto Chronicles, when they're going through Georgia, the Carolinas, and into Tennessee, they talk often about being given dogs to eat at different sites, or different places where they're stopping, different villages. Sometimes they say they're given 300 dogs to eat. They note that the dogs are small, that they're raised in people's houses so people can eat them, that people are eating them. In other cases, they note that, people don't eat the dogs, but they're letting the Spanish eat the dogs because they need food. So it's kind of unclear from the Spanish reports of what's going on with dog eating, but they are given dogs to eat in several places throughout the Southeast. And we also have some ethnographic accounts of eating dog before going into war. So kind of these war rituals of eating a dog. Emergency food resource and probably ceremonial food resource. I don't think dogs were like a staple food resource of Southeastern diets.
Right. Well, that would make sense. I mean, they seem to have had their place either as, hunters or pack animals or even companions, which I find all three to be equally interesting. There's one more thing I would like for you to comment on, Meagan, because I think there may be a story here. But you mentioned in a post at the Tennessee Archaeology Council site that the dogs you find most fascinating are the archaic dogs from the Tennessee River Valley in West Tennessee. What is it about this particular time period and these burials that you find most meaningful?
The dogs that are buried in these middle to late archaic shell mounds in West Tennessee, northern Alabama, and the Green River in Kentucky are very fascinating to me because they are usually buried in abundance. So in West Tennessee in particular, there are two sites where there are just tons of dogs. The Eva site is one. This is a middle archaic to late archaic site. And there are 20 dog burials from that site alone. The Big Sandy site, there are at least 18 dog burials. It's also a middle archaic to late archaic site. Up in Kentucky, some of these archaic sites have 60 to 100 dogs, same in Alabama. I just find that very fascinating that there's this kind of dog, just a tradition of burying dogs in and around human graves, mostly around human graves and not in human graves at this time period. I just found that very fascinating. Whenever I was starting off on this, I really just wanted to know why. Why are dogs being buried so frequently? What are they doing in society that's warranting this treatment and death? And also, just on a personal note, I grew up in Jackson, Tennessee, and spent many summers on the Tennessee River. And it really struck me whenever I started to get into this, like, oh, I was, swimming in the Tennessee River just right next to a lot of these archaeological sites, and I had no idea at the time. So that's part of it. But really, it's the ceremonialism that I just found fascinating, the mortuary behavior.
Meagan, are you a dog owner?
Well, I was. My family moved around a lot, and we had dogs up until I was 12, and then we just started moving, and then I went to college. And I'm still in college, and I don't have a yard. So I'm waiting until I have a house with a yard until I get a dog. But as soon as I have a house and a yard where, a dog would be very happy, I'm going to have a dog.
I think in the interim, while you aren't able to have a dog and facilitate a comfortable space for one, I think that, your work seems to be an extension of if I'm to be a psychologist here for a moment, you really want to have a dog, maybe. I don't know. But I mean, you'd have to love dogs, I would think, to undertake this kind of research and kind of had that fascination with what role they continue to play in our lives, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely would love to have a dog. They are the most fun animal. I have 3 cats, and they're just they just do whatever they want. They don't really play as much, and so I would love to have a dog. And I have lots of friends who have dogs, so I get a lot of time.
You've got a friend right here who has a dog, by the way, David Ian Howe. You have Strider.
Oh, yeah, I do have Strider. I'm glad he's famous now.
He's famous, yes. He has arrived. Tell us a little bit about Strider. What's your relationship with your dog, and does your relationship with Strider influence your research in any ways?
Absolutely. I got him when I was at grad school in University of Wyoming. He's what's called a Wyoming mountain dog. It's not like an established breed, but my professor had one, a few other people in town did, and I was like, I want that. And I normally support adoption, but I did get him from a local breeder. But he is what's called a Norwegian Elkhound, German Shepherd, and Alaskan Malamute mix. He's really smart, and I'd never raised a puppy. Like I said, I'd always adopted from start to finish. Well, hopefully not finish. He won't ever die. But It's difficult for sure, especially a dog that's like hyper intelligent. But he's photogenic. He's definitely like my best friend. He's definitely influenced some research. My parents' dog, when I was in college, definitely got me started on it because she was like my favorite dog. And then I got Strider, and I just like look at him and I'm like, man, like you look like a wolf. So like, what would people have thought back then? And then, and then he has, I like Strider.
And all the while, especially when you're laying there asleep at night, he looks at you and thinks, and David, you look like a human to me.
Yeah.
David and Meagan, thank you so much for being on the show. Do you guys have any links that you would like to share with the listeners? And of course, we've got a lot of links to articles and things we'll be putting in the show notes to accompany your appearance, but any links or any other kinds of information you'd like to put out at this time?
I have it's just at Ethnocynology on Instagram. And that's just, I post about different burials and different like anthropological things that I find interesting. It's mostly my dog, and I kind of tag food companies in there to see if they'll pick them up one day. But yeah, there's that on there. And then I also have a video about the history of dogs with Ted Ed coming out in the next month or so. And that will be on their just teded.com, or you can go to their YouTube page and it should pop out on there.
Excellent. We'll be sure and link that for you when it comes out. So once again, I want to thank you both for being here on the podcast with us, Meagan Dennison and David Ian Howe. Their first time, and certainly not their last time, here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. I'd like to thank again our wonderful guests, David Ian Howe and Meagan Dennison, for joining us. And we'll have links on the show notes there at 7ages.org to where you can find more information about their ongoing work. I'm sure it won't be the last time that you hear from them on this podcast. Well, it is the season of many things, in fact. The season of leaf changes, the season of bunkering down and weathering against the cold, preparing to fatten ourselves off of the feast of Thanksgiving and Christmas thereafter. But something I love to do with my family around the holidays also involves imbibing in the ceremonial liquids. The history of alcohol. And it's been a while since we've had an update on the alcoholic forefront. And guys, I got to ask you a little bit about one of my favorite mainstays of brewing culture, and that has to do with seasonal beers, more specifically fall seasonals. Now, you know, at craftbeer.com, they did an article about this recently, and it talks a little about the history behind fall seasonals. and more specifically, the nostalgic season, as they call it, for beer. And, writing for craftbeer.com, Andy Sparhawk writes that if I had to pick one season for beer, it would be fall. He says, sure, nothing says summer like Pilsners on the beach or sipping pale ales around a campfire. Winter is sure special for digging out some vintage barley wines to help stave off cabin fever, and even spring demands a certain cross-section of beers to enliven beer lovers from our fostery doldrums. But nothing beats fall seasonals, and for good reason. Before seasonal beers became a way to cater to the beer lover's beer-curious nature, beer was by definition seasonal, and that season in large part was fall, the true beer season. Now, I've never thought about fall as being the true beer season, but if I'm not drinking Guinness, I've got to tell you, often what I do to kind of break the monotony of the stouts, which I love here in this time of the year and actually all times of the year. I used to only drink stouts in the winter. Now I'll drink them all year round. But to kind of break the monotony, I do enjoy the seasonals. And right now, I'm imbibing one of, it's funny because I can now refer to them as our hometown brewery, Sierra Nevada, here in Asheville. And Jason, I took you when you were up here visiting, as we've heard on the podcast recently. You got to see the Sierra Nevada Brewing Facility in Mills River, North Carolina. So proud home of Sierra Nevada right here, the greater Asheville area, Mills River, if you will. But I'm drinking their Oktoberfest right now as we are concluding tonight's broadcast. And I do have to say that my favorite seasonals come out both in the fall and in the winter. And I know that some of the fall seasonals, I think, kind of complement the change of the season. The leaf color, they have an amber kind of an ale, and also kind of a maltier texture, brown ales and things like this, and darker pale ales maybe, and actually tell you through some porters as well. One of my all-time favorites, though, and James, I know you'll be able to relate to this because you being a brewer in our midst have made one of these of your own, but I recently discovered the Foothills Pumpkin Ale, which is one of their seasonals. And as much as I love Oktoberfest, I've always loved pumpkin beers for some reason. It's like a yearly tradition for me. Some people love pumpkin spice lattes. Well, I'm a pumpkin beer guy. But last year, before we went on our 7 Ages trip, James, you had brewed a pumpkin beer, and you actually brought samples for Jason and I, which we enjoyed immensely. And so, having brewed a pumpkin beer, do you favor that kind as far as the fall ale, or do you like Oktoberfest, or is there something else that you might prefer as far as a seasonal?
Well, let me back up and say I totally agree with the author of that article that fall really is the best season for beer. It just is. And I did make that pumpkin spice last year, and that's normally not something that I go in for. I'm usually not a pumpkin spice guy. I love pumpkin pie and that kind of thing. But as far as beer goes, I tried a couple last year, a little earlier than this, and I really enjoyed them. And I was kind of surprised because usually I don't go in for that kind of stuff, but I enjoyed it so much that I decided to brew one. And of course, you're talking about it, and I brewed it, and it came out really, really well. And I brewed 5 gallons of it, so I must have liked it because I drink pretty much all of it. And I want to say I hoarded it to myself because I did, I shared it. I love to share it with friends and family or whatever. But yeah, it was really good. So I do enjoy the pumpkin Oktoberfest style beer in the fall. I really do.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, the Marzens, the Oktoberfests, the pumpkin beers, but it's not just fall as far as seasonals. There are seasonals for all times of the year, but heading into winter, Jason, I know one that I've heard you talk about in the past have been the winter seasonals, which tend to be a little sweeter, a little more spicy. And by spicy, I don't mean flavor notes so much as literal spices introduced into the brewing process, which, introduce hints of cinnamon, nutmeg, allspice, and all kinds of different things that you literally would associate with dishes and often desserts from that time of the year.
Yeah, well, one thing that we have now in 2018 is the advent over the last decade of so many fantastic breweries, and you can't hardly go anywhere, be it Charleston, my hometown, Savannah, Asheville, or any major city without finding a plethora of different breweries to go, experiment with. And that's the beauty of it is there's so many choices today. So what I really enjoy is so many beer outlets, grocery stores even, you can now go make your own 6-pack. They have a bunch of individual beers. And so you can go try, 6 different beers from 6 different breweries and just kind of see which ones match the flavor profiles that you like, pair them with different foods, so many different ways to go about enjoying this particular season. But now, with all the advent of these breweries, every season really is fun because you'll see a whole new line for the summertime, a whole new line for the winter, a whole new line for each season. So you kind of look forward to the changing of the seasons to see what the new brews will be. But yeah, those wintertime, there's a whole sort of ritual that goes along with it. And we talk about the absence of ritual in modern society, but that is kind of a ritual. You got the fire going in the fireplace. It's the time when you're with friends and family around Christmas and Thanksgiving. And, nothing complements a good Thanksgiving meal or a good Sunday roast better than a good complimentary beer. So, of course, we always tell you to drink responsibly and all that, but go out and try some of these breweries. Another great thing with the brewery lifestyle is many of them have excellent food now. So you can go there and it's not your typical bar scene. People take their kids there. You see little kids running around and playing. People are playing games. There's, TVs and food, and it's a completely different lifestyle, almost kind of what you see over in European nations. So get out there, enjoy it, check out your local breweries, check out all the different seasonals, and I'm sure you'll find at least 10 or 12 that you'll really end up enjoying.
In fact, just to give you an idea of some of the fine breweries that may be in a locality near you, if you'd like to try one of these, Anaheim, California residents can check out Anaheim Brewery. They have a wonderful Oktoberfest lager on tap right now. Also in Chandler, Arizona, the Santan Brewing company has the Oktoberfest on tap as well. You can also find in Geneva, New York, the Warhorse Brewing Company's Rolling Storm. In Boynton Beach, Florida, we also have what's called the Due South Brewing Company, and they have an Oktoberfest also. Cape May Brewing in Cape May, New Jersey has an Oktoberfest. You'll also find one at the Enlightening Brewing Company in Moore Park, California. At Lombard Brewing in Flagstaff, Arizona, you'll find the Oktoberfest Marzen, hailing back to an ancient time and actually a reference to, or at least etymologically similar to, the idea of March, even though we tend to drink those beers later in the year. Lumberyard Brewing in Flagstaff, Arizona is where you'll find that. Then, of course, we've got in Sydney, Montana, the Meadowlark Brewing Company with their Fest beer. Also, Chuckanut Brewing in Bellingham, Washington has what's called their Old Fest on tap. And then finally, a fine Oktoberfest beer in Tempe, Arizona, a place I haven't visited in years, but I'd love to get back to. You'll find that at Pedal House there, and that's the German spelling, H-A-U-S, not H-O-U-S-E, but nonetheless, we see a lot of etymological similarities between all those. Well, fellas, all of that has got me quite parched and ready to refill my glass with the Sierra Nevada Oktoberfest. So I think it's about time for us to pony up at the bar, as we often do after one of these programs. I'm so glad, as always, to be able to share a little space with you guys and to share knowledge and wisdom about the ancient past with all of you out there. Head over to 7ages.org. Be sure and check out new articles, podcasts, and other content we provide right there. Fellas, it's about time, I think, to whet our proverbial whistles. What do you say?
I say cheers.
And I say I'm ordering one of those Reubens.
He's still hungry, folks. Well, indeed, we are hungry for history on this podcast. It is one of our favorite subjects, and that's why we bring you information each week about anthropology, culture, history, and all things of interest to people all over the world and all throughout time. It is the 7 Ages Audio Journal.